Hello, this is To Be Read, in which we interview authors about their books on Brazilian themes. Today we're going to talk to political scientist Carlos Pereira about his new book, Why Hasn't Brazilian Democracy Died?, which he wrote with André Melo. Both are college professors and columnists at major Brazilian newspapers. Before we go any further, I would like to remind you that you can watch this full conversation on video on the Brazilian Report's Patreon page for free. The link will be in the episode description. I hope to see you there. Throughout the 4 years of Jair Bolsonaro's government from 2019 to 2022, Carlos Pereira and Melo were swimming against the tide, supporting an idea that the majority of political scientists present in the Brazilian public debate strongly contested. According to Pereira and Melo, Brazil's democracy was not as threatened as their colleagues claimed, arguing that it was strong enough to resist the attacks of any authoritarian ruler. Indeed, Brazil didn't suffer a coup, though international studies pointed toward a decline in the quality of Brazilian democracy and public policies during the Bolsonaro administration. Understanding whether the country was in fact on the brink of the abyss, it's important to know what parts of Brazil's democratic regime work and what needs to improve. And without a doubt, Why Hasn't Brazilian Democracy Died greatly enriches this discussion. Professor, thanks so much for joining us on To Be Read.
Thanks for the invitation, Isabella. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. Your book goes into great depth on a number of episodes of Brazilian political life over the last decade, analyzing how Brazil's multi-party presidential system works. For this interview in particular, I chose to focus on questions on the Bolsonaro government, as the impact of the rise of far-right populists remains a hot topic for democracies around the world. So first, to clarify for those watching us, why didn't Brazilian democracy die? Evaluates the strength of the Brazilian political system to resist attack, considering its constitutional rules and the historical characteristics of its institutions. But looking at the other side of this story, how serious was Jair Bolsonaro's attack on democracy? How do you compare him to other Brazilian presidents?
So that's a very complex question, Isabella. Let's try to address it carefully. And the book, and started from the book title, is a direct response to a literature on democratic backsliding, particularly, and Levitsky and Ziblatt, and who wrote a war bestseller, and how democracies die. And according to this literature, not only them, but the entire literature, because there are hundreds of scholars nowadays addressing this issue. And the most important variable explaining and backsliding or the erosion of democracy around the globe is the election of autocrats. And according to them, democracy no longer dies via military coups, but rather, and paradoxically, it dies via the election, the free election, competitive election of extreme populist autocrats who, once in power, take advantage of this position in order to strengthen and his or her power, and weakening and the checks and balance institutions. But my criticism to this literature, not only mine, but Marcos Melo, who is my co-author, and I criticism to this literature, is that they only observe this phenomena and from the perspective of the aggressor, from the perspective of the populist, from the perspective of the elected populace who would act And societies and institutions in many different countries would be and defenseless victims of those populists. And we Marcus and I, we are not happy with that explanation.